I'm investigative journalist Mollye Barrows. For years, I've covered the stories that made headlines in Northwest Florida and all along the Gulf Coast. Murders, missing persons, and mysteries of all kinds. These cases are far from over for many victims because the full story has yet to surface. Join me for Gulf Coast Confidential, where I dive into the saltier side of the South and expose the lies, greed, and corruption that often weighs down the truth. It's time to turn the tide and get a shot at justice. Hi, I'm investigative journalist Mollye Barrows, and I've been covering crime in Florida's Panhandle for years. Welcome to my series, Gulf Coast Confidential. From murders to mysteries, I explore some of the saltier stories that surface in Northwest Florida and all along the Gulf of Mexico. My co-host is Pam Hill. If you're familiar with Gulf Coast Confidential Conversations, then you know Pam's sister, Sharon Aydelott, was murdered by her son on Christmas Eve of 2013. And because of that, she has a unique perspective on a lot of these cases that we talk about here on Gulf Coast Confidential as a survivor of violent crime, a grief and loneliness researcher, and a pharmacist as well. So Pam, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
As you know, in this episode, Kid Killers, we're talking about part 2 of what is almost an unthinkable crime to people, murdering children, especially parents who kill their own kids. And sadly, there is no shortage of these crimes. In part 1, we talked about the case of Chad Doerman, who shot his 3 young sons to death with a rifle. He gunned them down in front of their mother and sister who tried to save them. Well, this is part 2 of Kid Killers on the case of Lam Luong. And here's what happened. On the morning of January 7th, 2008, Fan and Luong, Fan is his wife, they had argued, her name is Q Fan, and Lam Luong, they were arguing. She was headed to work at a nail salon. He loaded up all their kids, all except for one of the children, Ryan, in the family van. This was about 8:30 in the morning. A few minutes later, though, he returned for the 3-year-old boy, Ryan, and prosecutors say that's when he made the 15 to 20-minute drive to Dolphin Island Bridge, stopped at the top, and threw all of his children off one by one into the Mississippi Sound more than 80 feet below. Ryan Fan was 1 month away from turning 4. Hannah Luong was 2 years and 8 months old. Lindsay was a month away from turning 2, and Danny Luong was still a baby at 4 months old. All of those children he threw off of a multi-story bridge. An autopsy later determined that all the children were alive when they hit the water. The cause of death for Ryan, Danny, and Lindsay was blunt force trauma and asphyxia due to drowning. And the cause of death for Hannah was drowning. So she actually survived the fall without any injuries, but because she couldn't swim, she drowned. I mean, it doesn't get any more horrible than that, than Doerman hunting his own children down with a rifle. What is wrong with these men?
I don't know. And I don't even know that I would call them men, because it's just a person not acting right. And there's nothing that would say that this would be something you could do. And I remember hearing about this on the news, being as stammered as I am right now, going, who in God's name would do this stuff?
I know.
I mean, unreal. Right here, people say, oh, that kind of stuff never happened where I'm at. It happens everywhere.
I know. And I was anchoring and reporting for our local ABC affiliate at the time. And I remember just the national news coverage it got, the local news coverage it got, because it was just such a horrific crime. Not only were the details of the crime just horrible and unimaginable, but the community was just so devastated by it. You know, they were involved in searching for the bodies of the babies. They were completely horrified that a father would do something like this. There was some mystery he created, and I'll give some background on that in just a second. But, you know, he didn't admit right away to what he had done. So he had the family and the community out searching for these children when he knew all along where they were, and that was in a watery grave. Mm-hmm. So before we get into some of those details, I'll give you a little background for those who aren't familiar with the case. So this couple met in 2004. About 4 years before he murdered his own children. Lam Luong was 34 years old at the time. He was a shrimp fisherman. And Q Fan was 20 at the time, and she became his common-law wife. In fact, when he met her, she was pregnant with a child from a previous relationship. And although her baby boy, Ryan, wasn't his, Luong had no problem raising him like his own, according to the family and everyone who knew him. But then Hurricane Katrina hit. It slammed into Louisiana and Mississippi in 2005. It was a powerful Category 3 storm, and it brought unprecedented flooding to the Gulf Coast, including the fishing village of Bayou La Battery in Mobile County, Alabama. And that's a small city. They barely had more than 2,000 people when they experienced the largest storm surge ever recorded in the area, and it destroyed a lot of those shrimp and fishing boats, which is how a lot of people made their living. So it messed up the whole local economy. The economy was devastated. People who relied on those jobs in those fishing boats were devastated, and a lot of people left. They had to move because they didn't have their homes or their jobs, and they had to find security elsewhere and employment. And so a lot of people did move hoping for those better opportunities. And that's what happened with Luong and his family. They were just a trio at that point, and they moved to Hinesville, Georgia, which it turns out is a small city about an hour outside of Savannah. And Q-Fan got a job at a nail salon, and Luong first got a job at a car wash and then later as a chef at a restaurant. So they spent 2 years there and working and trying to get back on their feet. But in that time, they had 3 children together, back to back. Hannah first, then Lindsay, and then Danny. And sadly, although their family was growing, their relationship was falling apart at the same time. Q-Fan said Luong took up with a girlfriend. He stopped going to work. He started smoking crack cocaine, which when you look at his record, it's something that he had dabbled with before. And then he got fired, and then he didn't seem to be too worried about it. So she's upset, frustrated. Here she is working, trying to hold down this family and support them all on her own. And then this philandering, drug-abusing baby daddy. Mm-hmm. So she goes back to Mobile where she had family. And in December of 2007, so right before 2008, she and her 4 little ones packed up, moved back to Mobile, Alabama. She moved in with her mom and her sister, who was also living with her mom. And her sister had 4 of her own children. So here you got 8 kids, 2 sisters, the mom, and guess who wants to come along?
Guess who? I can only imagine. And in their culture, it's a very matriarchal culture. And women by nature were softer and more forgiving and he just needs help and all. I can just see it. So they went from 2.5 and then 3 little family to 12 in one house.
Right, in one house. And then Lam Luong comes along and he's like, well, I just want to be here too.
Yeah, of course.
But his behavior didn't change at all. He was still taking up with the girlfriend, still doing drugs.
All right. No job, not worried about it, and smoking crack cocaine.
Right, but living off of them and providing no help. So anyhow, they were frustrated with him, not to mention the fact that he was always asking them for money, and I don't understand it, but they gave it to him, and they say he used it to support his drug habit, and he often stayed out all night using crack. And the women later testified that he could be an affectionate father, but he was not very attentive or a good provider, and they were not afraid to let him know how unhappy they were with his behavior, which, as I'm researching this story, and if you haven't heard the nuts and bolts, you can check it out in Gulf Coast Confidential. It's called Drowning in Remorse. And I get into a lot more detail about this case. And in this particular case, kid killers, Pam and I are talking about some of the other issues that are common themes that run through some of these types of crimes. So I'm just giving you some of the background and the details of this. But as I was researching it, I just couldn't imagine why these women took him back in. I mean,
I can't either. And maybe I was sitting here wondering, is something wrong with me? One of those strikes would be enough for me. People show you who they are, believe them. I say that almost every daggum thing we do. Why do people want to sign up? If you don't care about your life, why are you trying to make your children's life harder? Ask for help and all that. I do not know why they do that. And I don't know, because addiction and someone acting a fool over drugs, sometimes people just enable them so they'll go away.
Right. And here she hadn't even been back home, maybe not even a month. Like she moved back in December. He killed those kids the following month in January. And they had argued that morning like they had been because she did have a job. She did go back to work at another nail salon. The whole family was working and they were just tolerating him, I guess, hoping that he would get his life back together and he would find another job and get off drugs. But instead, it was worst case scenario. I'm sure they never in a million years dreamed he would do something like that. But he wasn't contributing, to say the least. And to what I was saying earlier, he didn't admit right away to the killing. So this is the horror of, what they experienced. They're having to wonder what happened for about 24 hours or 48 hours. And here's some of those details. He lied to cover for himself. He lied to cover up with what he had done. After he had thrown the kids off the bridge, he stayed out all day. He wouldn't answer their phone calls because they were wondering where he was. And his mother-in-law had been calling him all day asking about the kids. And at first he refused to answer. And then he told her he gave the children to a woman named Kim. And when the children's mother, Q, Fan, learned what was happening, she insisted they call the police and report their kids missing. And at the Bayou La Batterie police station, Lam Luong kept to his story that this woman named Kim had taken them. He had given them to her. He even went door to door with his wife and her family, supposedly looking for the children when he knew good and well what had happened to them. And his sister-in-law, Tracy Fan, would later testify that she asked him in near hysterics, "Why did you give the kids to people you don't know?" And then she said she told him, quote, "Crack people will do anything," end quote, and that he looked down and started crying. So the next day, Luong suggested to police that perhaps they could find this mystery woman and the children in nearby Biloxi, Mississippi. So police drove him to that Gulf Coast city. But after riding around for about an hour, Luong finally said he didn't know where to find them, and they went back to Alabama. And it was not long after they got back that he finally admitted to his wife that their children were dead. And she later testified that he, quote unquote, kept laughing when he told her they would never be found. And she fell to her knees, grieving, crippled by shock and grief, and Luong then took police back to the top of Dauphin Island Bridge and showed them where he parked when he threw his children to their deaths. And this next part was something I pulled out of court records, and it was just heartbreaking as well. But witnesses were later found who had been driving over the bridge at the time he had parked and were throwing the kids off one by one. And they, of course, had no idea what exactly was happening. No one saw him do the actual deed, but they did see various children missing. They were telling parts of a story one by one as these witnesses drove by. They were seeing various parts of this tragedy unfold and didn't even realize what was happening. Several people saw the children still in the van, parked on the bridge, including a little girl, a toddler with dark hair that was in pigtails. And I could just see that in my mind's eye. You know, that's just such a precious little image. And we've all seen little kids and in pigtails. I can just see her sitting there, never dreaming that her dad was going to do what he did. And Lindsay's grandmother said that she left that morning with her hair in dark pigtails. So that was Lindsay. And another witness saw Luong straddling the rail of the bridge, and another saw him throwing something off. Naturally, they wouldn't assume that those were his small children. And Luong, of course, who did he blame for his actions? His family.
Of course.
Quote unquote, "My family, they make me," Luong told them in broken English. This is what he said to police. Police say he told them his wife and family looked down on him like he was nothing. And he admitted he thought about killing himself when he was on the bridge, but he didn't because he, get this, quote, "wanted to see my wife and family, what they looked like," end quote, to see their faces when they got word of the children's deaths.
Yeah. That's the only truthful thing he said.
Yeah, I don't think he ever intended to kill himself.
No, the only truthful thing he said is, "I want to hurt you. I want to hurt you bad, irreparably, past anything. I want your mind to be consumed with this. It's the worst." Like I talked about in the other case with Chad Dorman, it's the big button I can push to make sure that you are forever tormented.
Yeah, angry because they were holding him accountable. Angry because they weren't signing off on his bad behavior.
Well, what about being grateful that they feed you, being grateful that they house you, grateful that they give you a car to drive, grateful that they trusted you with the children that you killed 80 feet in the air. And, you know, I think about people driving by. I've driven by on the bridges around here and seen people doing stuff that I'm like, what are they doing? I mean, because I'm not a nosy person. I'm a curious person. But and so many things, and I thought about that. I mean, how must the people feel that drove by and remember seeing something like that? And because like this man's got the case of the giggles like every other murderer and rapist we've talked about. I fail to see what's so freaking funny about all these damn things. It's not funny to people like me. It's not funny to anybody. Right. You know, that tells you right there they're insane. Yeah. This giggling, this grown men giggling. I don't know. Why does that make me so mad?
Well, it's just this selfish, tiny world that they lived in where they're the center of their own universe. They're at the top of their own mountain, and anybody that tries to take them off the top is an enemy. So somehow or another, in his mind, like killing these kids was and hurting his wife and family was more important than getting his own SHIT together and living a responsible, normal life.
And then they do all this giggling and acting silly and everything like that. But when the police comes up, they straighten up. It's the dangest thing I've ever seen.
He could get it together enough to lie. He got it together enough to make the decision not to throw himself off the top of that bridge.
Yeah. And I think about that. I mean, the kids, they were obviously uber obedient, because I don't know, when I was a little kid, I'd probably be running around almost getting in traffic or something. But all four of them with baby, 4-month-old is a baby like this still, that you're holding up against your body. You know, a 4-month-old. I heard that right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, and then they're all under 4.
Mm-hmm.
So I can only imagine the others, that maybe the one that's almost 3 could kind of say, you know, but the 2-year-old, and they probably think it's something dad's doing. Yeah.
That'll be fun.
Yeah.
I know. And this is the heartbreaking part of it, too, is that that's not heartbreaking enough. But there was this massive community-wide search that began for the bodies of these missing children. And that's what I remember from the anchor desk, is just night after night of these searches continuing and then updates. And even though we were in Pensacola and Mobile are considered part of the main market, or the same market, I should say. But a lot of the Mobile-based stations, this was on their newscast every single night. And we covered it almost every single night too, but it was more of a Mobile story. You know, we covered the highlights. But that's just what I remember, is just the massive community turnout. I mean, it wasn't just in Mobile and Bayou La Battery. It was all the surrounding communities. I mean, there's no hearts more generous than you will find along here in the Gulf Coast. And
the Gulf Coast rocks. It is awesome here, and the lifestyle, and we live in paradise.
Yes. And people are appreciative, and they also do come together, I think, when they see a tragedy like that. And that's what happened. So 150 people, mostly volunteers, all took part in the search. This is heartbreaking. I can't even imagine being the emergency responder or the police that have to issue this particular warning. But they said waterfront landowners in the area, they asked them to walk their properties for signs of their little bodies. And the children were found one by one over a 2-week period. Baby Danny, the 4-month-old, was found first on Saturday, January 12th, so about 4 days after he was thrown off the bridge in 2008, nearly 13 miles west of the bridge on the banks of an isolated marsh area. The next day, 3-year-old Ryan was found more than 16 miles west of the bridge. And on Tuesday, January 15th, 1-year-old Lindsay was found 18 miles west of the bridge in Mississippi. And 5 days later, 2-year-old Hannah was found floating in the Gulf of Mexico, south of Venice, Louisiana. That was more than 140 miles west of the bridge. So that last one apparently really was especially hard on the mom. There was a family spokesperson at the time who said that once her body was found, she really had a difficult time. And he said that he felt like it was basically because it was almost a sense of relief. All her children had been recovered. They would all be buried together. And in fact, neighbors and residents rallied around the devastated Fan family. A local cemetery donated plots for the children to be buried, and they reserved one for their mom, too.
Oh, that's sweet.
So when the time comes, she can join. And a local school raised money for her as well. In Bayou La Battery, they even put up a memorial at Maritime Park to honor their 4 little lives. So these people just did all they could to let this family know that they were tremendously sorry and wanted to do everything they could to alleviate their pain. And it was sweet. The community was actually invited to the graveside service for the children, and the Fan family hosted an appreciation dinner for all the volunteers who spent days searching for their bodies. And even during Mardi Gras, so if you're not familiar, I know a lot of people think about Mardi Gras with New Orleans, but Mobile, it's extremely popular, and it's a huge to-do. And that year's Mardi Gras celebration, they held a moment of silence for those lives lost as well. So the tragedy drew really strong reactions of sympathy, anger, as well as outrage that if you bring it up, people still talk about it to this day.
People know about it. And it's just so unbelievable. Here we go again. Unbelievable, these things. Hannah's little body traveled, 140 miles?
Yeah.
That is from here to Biloxi and then some.
Yeah.
From Pace, Florida to Biloxi and then some. I mean, the mother, the family, the aunts, the grandmother, everybody. Just unbelievable.
I know. And then the other part that was unbelievable is basically what became of Lam Luong. His defense attorneys would later say he was intoxicated at the time he killed his kids. He was high on drugs and alcohol. But police say witnesses who encountered him not long after he threw those children off the bridge say he did not appear to be under the influence. that actually when he left the bridge, he was running low on gas and he tried to get several people to help him get gas. They all said he did not appear to be impaired. There's video of him at a gas station trying to get gas. In fact, he showed up at the nail salon where the children's mother, Q Fan, worked at 10 a.m. that morning. So not long after he killed their children, and he asked her for gas money and she gave it to him. And police say he went and used it to buy crack. So he stayed out all day. His van got a flat. And so that was when the whole shenanigans began, where he was trying to make up a story about what actually happened to the kids. But in 2009, he was 38, and he was tried and convicted on 5 counts of capital murder, 4 counts for each of his children, and an additional count because multiple murders were involved. He didn't really present much of a defense. At one point, he pled guilty and told the court that he, quote unquote, wanted to die, but then he changed his plea when he realized the trial was going to happen regardless. And of course, prosecutors had no trouble convincing the jury that he was guilty of what they called a vengeful and spiteful crime committed against his family. Jurors returned that unanimous verdict in like 40 minutes and recommended that he receive the death penalty. And the judge in that case agreed, and he also added that guards should show Lam Luong pictures of his children every day that he was on death row. And I know you like that.
I do. I like this judge. I have something about, like, one of the things that I think that we need to do as citizens is don't just vote for judges just because they're on there and they're a person that's top.
Or you recognize their name.
Their cute little name or their name's Bubba or whatever. It's important. I've learned that from dealing with the cases we're on. Judges need to be smart. Judges need to know the law. Judges need to be tough on killers and not try to be a panty waste about if the department of this or that's going to come back on them or something. I mean, be tough. The man killed his children.
Right.
So what if you have to answer to the department of ding, dang, dong? Who cares?
Right.
Answer it and tell them, murder is wrong. Murder is against the law, especially for little kids.
I know.
I love this judge. He manned up. He smarted up. He's the shiznit.
Yes. Well, and Lam Luong was on death row for almost a decade, and then his conviction and sentence were overturned on appeal. You can read and find out more about that or listen more about that on Drowning in Remorse, where I get more into what happened with all of that. But in essence, the trial was thrown out, or the conviction was thrown out because his counsel said that there basically hadn't been enough work done looking into his background and mitigating circumstances. They also had an IQ test done, and it was determined. The appeals court basically agreed that he needed to get a new trial, and in 2018, he did stand trial again for the murders. He was convicted of their deaths, but this time the state attorney general's office and the defense lawyers both asked the judge to change Luong's sentence to life imprisonment without parole because his new IQ test showed that he was intellectually disabled. And the reason that matters is that it makes him ineligible for the death penalty because the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in 2002 that the Constitution prohibits the execution of persons with intellectual disabilities. So how intellectually disabled is he? Well, Luong was tested by state experts as well as defense experts, and he received IQ scores ranging from 49, 51, and 57 on 4 different tests. And then another set of tests, he received scores of 55, 60, and 61 for adaptive functioning instruments. So even though most everybody agreed that these disabilities manifested before the age of 18, anyway, that they just said he was intellectually disabled, so he wasn't eligible for the death penalty, and that's why he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. But during that trial, they did go back and look at what potentially could have been some of the mitigating factors and what his defense counsel said, and the ACLU was also in on this case to a certain extent. And they said a lot of his mental illness and disabilities went unnoticed in the first trial because of the court's rush to judgment, because people were so passionate about the case, and because of the language barrier. He's a Vietnamese native. His father had been an American serviceman in the Vietnam War, had a relationship with his mother, but he had, for the most part, he had grown up in Vietnam where, according to experts, these mixed race and mixed nationality children are not necessarily welcomed with open arms in the Vietnamese culture, that there was some bullying. But again, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be punished for throwing your children off the bridge.
Admiration is what they said that was his culture, and basically, there's no mitigating factor. The children's IQ, I don't even know what it was, but they're babies, a 4-month-old. Nothing can mitigate that you get to drown and blunt force trauma from 80 feet tall to 4 children that are yours especially. There's no mitigating factor. There's no translator that can make that make sense to me. There's no my childhood stinks type of thing. This is what people's childhood, a lot of people have a bad childhood. I had a good childhood, but a lot of people do. It's not a license to kill, and it's not making you get to sign on for how to get away with murder.
Right. I know, which is essentially what he did, although he is serving a lifetime behind bars at William E. Donaldson Correctional Institution. That's a medium security prison west of Birmingham, Alabama. So your neck of the woods up there where you work as a pharmacist. Mm-hmm. But his attorney did say that he was, quote unquote, extremely remorseful for his crimes. I would hope so. Yeah. But again, I don't understand how you get to that point. How I get that drugs poisons and ruins people's minds. Any sort of addiction can affect and impair their judgment. But to have that in you to do something as awful as killing your children out of revenge. I mean, you've heard cases where mothers have drowned their children or hurt their children as a result of postpartum. And it's almost this mentality of, and a lot of times they'll take their own lives right afterwards because it's like, I don't want them to suffer like I'm suffering. I don't want them to be in a situation where they can't be protected and I'm going to take myself out. I won't be here to protect them, so I'll take them out too. That's not what he did. Yeah. He was like, I want to see my girlfriend. Yeah. I want money for drugs. I don't want to hear from these nagging females at the house. Right. I want them to take care of me. I want them to take care of my kids. Mm-hmm. Oh, but you know what? They're still going to gripe at me. They're still going to nag me about criticizing my way of life. Well, I'll show them. I'll kill all these kids. Mm-hmm. That's a far cry.
Yeah. And addiction, the very definition of addiction is you do stuff that you said you would never do. Mm-hmm. And then the enabling that's in here and the fear. Yeah. The addict is powerful. The addict keeps everybody off balance. The addict just goes through like a tornado or a tsunami, and everybody basically is just holding on, trying to minimize the angst and the disturbances.
The chaos.
Right. So thank God there's help and stuff, but most addicts are not going to take themselves in for help. And I admit the language barrier, maybe the culture barriers, for them, they may not have known because in some countries, they just hide their crazy people or hide their addicts or whatever, like we do over here a lot. Mm-hmm. But, the thing is that every one of these cases is where the person, the killer or the murderer, they do exactly what they want, when they want, and how they want. And I say this every time, and you're going to like it.
Absolutely. And I know, and I felt like you did when I was reading and researching this case, when I was when I was first doing the drowning and remorse story. And this is certainly not to blame the victims in any way, shape, or form, or the mom, because who would have ever thought in a million years that he was capable of doing something like that? Never. But I guess thinking about poor decisions that I've made in my life, and I look back and I'm thinking, well, how can I, was there anything I could have done differently? And I recognize that perhaps there were my own personal issues that made me put up with behavior that I never should have put up with. So it's hard to see, and I've tried to put myself in her shoes. It's hard to see, and she was so young, and those kids were so young, and I'm sure there's part of her that's thinking the children need their dad, and he needs to be a provider, and maybe if we just ride this out, he'll get his stuff back together and he'll get a job again and he'll be a father and he'll be a provider. But I would just say to anyone listening, no matter how old you are, if you're in a situation where somebody's making you either feel bad about yourself, even if you don't necessarily feel like you're in danger, but if they're not pulling their weight, go ahead and cut your losses or set some strong boundaries. And I know that's so much easier said than done. And I don't mean to be armchair quarterback, hindsight's 20/20 in this situation, but domestic violence is very real, as you know, and you've experienced personally in your own life. But ask for help until your voice is raw. Ask for help. Pound on the doors. Make somebody listen.
Write letters. These are all letters I've written to a judge that's chosen not to answer me back. But the beautiful thing is I have them.
Yes.
There. And I will push them out over these years. And because you're not going to kill my sister and think it's okay.
Right. Or that people have forgotten, or that there won't be some kind of accountability and protection for yourself. So those would be some of my takeaways from this, is if you are in a situation where you're dealing with somebody who is an addict and they're not necessarily in their right mind, don't sacrifice yourself to save them. Don't sacrifice your own family to save them. They are responsible for themselves. As difficult as it can be, there is help available. If you are experiencing domestic violence, you know someone who is, you can call 911 or the National Domestic Violence Hotline, 1-800-799-SAFE or 7233. You can also find them online, thehotline.org. So there are resources out there. There is help out there. Maybe it's just talking with someone, sharing your fears and concerns. I imagine that mom in the Doerman case, the one who had to watch as her husband shot their 3 boys. I mean, you know, a neighbor talked about how he was angry every day and he verbally punished them and he treated them like crap. Those were his words, actually, a little harsher than that.
A little harsher.
But that, you know, my heart goes out to her too, because you know she didn't want that. Perhaps financially she didn't feel like she was free or able to support herself, you know, and I'm sure she never dreamed that one day he was going to say, let's have a nap together, and then he's going to wake up and grab a rifle out of the safe next to the bed and end their little lives and hunt them down like small game. But, you know, that is what ended up happening. And I think people just need to know that there is help out there. Talk to someone, listen to someone who would encourage you to make maybe some hard choices and difficult choices, but it's so worth it.
It is. And I think that when we kind of, for lack of a better word, get naked about what's happening to us. Right,
yes.
Vulnerable. Because vulnerability equals intimacy. To be intimate with someone, you have to be vulnerable, and vice versa. And sometimes, I don't want my stuff out there. Well, my sister didn't tell everything that was going on in her family, and she ended up dead.
Yeah, exactly. Oh my gosh, because you're trying to protect the kids from what people will think, and just, you know, talking about the terrible things that their dad had done in that particular situation. But yeah, so you certainly speak from experience, and anything else that you think would be important for people to take away from this?
I just think when people start acting a fool, you need to save yourself. And the other thing about this is the judges. I am that is my new thing. Look into judges. Don't go vote without knowing who they are. See if they're tough on crime and if they really mean it. And if you don't know, ask some of the prosecutors around town, and let's see how that goes. Because this stuff is not right. We cannot mitigate it to death. Let's stop doing that. There's nothing that says killing your children one by one, throwing them off an 80-foot bridge is right.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Pam. And thank you for joining us on Kid Killers on Gulf Coast Confidential Conversations. If you'd like to listen to this or any other episode, you can find it on Gulf Coast Confidential YouTube channel and anywhere you listen to your favorite podcast. We'll see you next time.